Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Indigenous Nightmare podcast. Today, I am sitting with Dr. Gerald Horne and Dr. Katrina Hazard. Dr. Gerald Horne holds the Moores Professorship History of African American Studies. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has also written extensively, over 30, I want to say over 36 books. I believe he said 40, if I'm not mistaken, in the interview that we did on Decolonized Buffalo, about the film industry as well. Dr. Horne received his PhD in history from Columbia University, his JD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Princeton University. Dr. Katrina Hazard, known as one of the nation's leading dance researchers. Katrina Hazard, Donald PhD author and lecturer and professor, and the author of 2 scholarly books and numerous articles of African American dance and culture, and one of the books of poetry, her first book, Jukin, The Rise of Social Dance and Formations in African American Culture, published by Temple City Press. Won the De La Torre Bueno Special Citation of Dance and Research. Her second book, Mojo Working the Old African American Hoodoo System. See right here, sorry you guys. This will be edited. University of Illinois, published by the University of Illinois Press, explores sets forth a new theory of the ring shout. So I want to thank you guys for joining, but I also want to let everybody know that we're sitting here with Decolonized Buffalo podcast, for which we are also sitting here with Derek, aka Plants Fanon, and sitting here with my Oceanic communist comrade, Lisiate Vuna. So I want to thank everybody for their energy and for being here today. And, thank you guys. How are you doing today, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Oh, it's all good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. How are you doing today, Dr. Katrina Hazard?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for attending. So the first question that I have is going to be for Dr. Gerald Horne, and it's mainly a question on the negative implications of the papal bull on Black and Indigenous people of the across the globe.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I guess you can fairly say that the Vatican, the man oftentimes referred to as His Holiness, gave a pass to the Iberian powers, in particular, speaking of Spain and Portugal, to exploit and plunder indigenous land in what is called the Americas. And this obviously sets the stage after the liquidation and genocide of the indigenous for the implantation forcibly of an enslaved African population in the Americas, of which I am a descendant. Your audience also should recognize that it was not long before this, quote, gift, unquote, to the Iberians got caught up in religious sectarian politics, because there is a reason why we're sitting here right now in North America speaking English, as opposed to not being here at all or speaking Spanish or Portuguese. What I mean is, as your audience probably knows, about 1517, Martin Luther, a dissident Catholic, led a secessionist movement from the Vatican, helping to establish what is now known as the Protestant faith, a branch of Christianity. And it did not take long, that is to say about maybe 15 to 20 years, for that secessionist tendency to spread to London. Your audience may know the story of Henry VIII, the monarch in London, who supposedly was disappointed with the church because he could not get a divorce. And interestingly enough, that led him to expropriate church property, which was quite considerable, and oust, if not liquidate, priests. I talk about this, by the way, in my 16th century book. and of course sign up for the Protestant faith. This leads to an incessant round of conflict in his backyard that continues to this very day. I'm sure you're familiar with the point that Northern Ireland is considered to be under the crown in London, and yet it has been split on the axis of Protestant versus Catholic since the days of Henry VIII, and that conflict has yet to be resolved. What happens is that the Iberians had a religious qualification for settlement in their colonies, as they called them, in the land they called the Americas. The Protestants, the scrappy underdogs, did not have enough warm bodies to go around. And so what happens is they make a historic compromise, and like a drummer improvising wildly in a jazz club, they move steadily towards the construction of what we now call whiteness. That is to say, those who had been warring in England's backyard, Protestant versus Catholic, even Christian versus Jewish, all of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they're transformed into this new politics of identity called whiteness. And then that spreads like mushrooms after a spring rain. And the English, who had been warring with the Irish, and the British, who had been warring with the Germans, and the Germans versus Poles, and the Poles, who had been warring with the Russians, and the Serbs, who had been warring with the Croats, and the Northern Italians versus Southern Italians, the French Protestants versus French Catholics. The list is endless. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic in a maneuver that would make Madison Avenue blush, they adopt and adapt this new identity of whiteness. And those not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness, which of course include the indigenous population, the African population, are treated as outliers or treated as subhuman, less than human. And it's fair to say that that ugly legacy has yet to be extirpated, which is one of the reasons why you continue to have these obscene police lynchings, as you witnessed in Memphis, Tennessee, in January 2023. So in sum and substance, I noticed that in the New York Amsterdam News, which is a Black paper in New York City, a UN special rapporteur dealing with issues of African descent suggested that the Vatican should apologize or perhaps deepen whatever apology it may have made. And I think that that's highly appropriate and certainly would be a step towards the ultimate apology, which would be sweeping reparations.
Thank you for that. So I didn't say before we started the recording, but I did specify in the episode that we did with Decolonized Buffalo with Rick here that I am Afro-Indigenous. You gave me a couple books for me to, to go and read, which I have been reading, by the way.
Really? Good for you.
Yes. Yes, I've been reading The American Genocide by Ben Madley, and I've been reading the Afro-Indigenous History of the United States by Kyle T. Mays. So giving me very, very good insight. So I just wanted to say that just briefly, thank you for that. But me being Afro-Indigenous, there's a lot of dates that kind of are significant to me. And one of them is the Portola expedition. So I wanted you, for the viewers that might not understand, what that was, could you kind of go in brief, what that kind of expedition was to Indigenous people?
So what we're basically talking about, once again, is the Spanish and the Spanish invasion of California. Now, what's interesting is that supposedly this invasion takes place in the late 18th century, and supposedly it was the first recorded European land entry and exploration of the interior of the present-day state of California. But as I say in my 16th century book, I think it was as early as the 1540s. if I'm not mistaken, you had the Spanish conquistador, I think his name was Juan Cabrillo, who invades what is now San Diego. Now, the official explanation might be referring to the establishment of permanent settlements, because it's fair to suggest that the Spanish who invaded the archipelago named after King Philip, speaking of the Philippines, in that same 16th century, and many of these forces were sailing from Mexico, which they had also invaded in the 16th century. And as you know, California was part of Mexico up until the US war of the 1840s. So I think it's fair to say as well that the arrival of the Spanish invaders, on the one hand, it was a recipe for genocide and liquidation. But on the other hand, as the subsequent history of California tends to suggest, perhaps unwittingly, the Spanish were just paving the way for future invaders. That is to say, if you look at Florida, for example, which the Spanish invaded in 1565, more or less, but then were forced out by the United States in about 1819, 1820. By the time they had been forced out, of course, they had cleared the land, so to speak, of the indigenous, that is to say, committing genocide. And so, in some ways, they reduced the labor and the costs of the genocidaires headquartered in the capital, now known as Washington, D.C. It's quite striking and remarkable that the three largest U.S. states today, California, Texas, and Florida, all used to be Spanish territories. And in fact, Florida was under the Spanish flag longer than it has been under the U.S. flag, 1565 to about 1819 versus 1819 to 2023. And you could say something similar with regard to Texas, where also in the 16th century, you had settlements established by the conquistadores.
Thank you. Thank you. You pointed out something that I think is very, very important for people to really hone in on, is that Mexico owned California, so to say, for a very, very short time. It wasn't for a very long time. And so I'm going to pass this over to Rick, because he has questions that correlate with what you just talked about. So go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, thank you. My question is for both Dr. Horne and Dr. Hazard. In Dr. Horne's book, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, he shows a difference in the methods of colonization between the Spanish and the British, primarily how Black people didn't have, little to none political power under the British colonization system. But since the American colonial system, or the project, is rooted in British colonization, do either of you feel like now the American settler project is evolving to include people of color? Like, for example, I said Candace Owens, that is promoting U.S. imperialism, or do you feel, or like the Enrique Tarrio, who is Afro-Cuban, he's the leader of the right-wing militia, the Proud Boys. What's your guys' observation? And I ask because, both of you I consider elders. I'm 40 years old. You guys are a little older than me, So you guys have seen political development on your time. So I ask both of you, Dr. Hazard and Dr. Horne, this question.
Well, I'll respond briefly, then pass the mic. I mean, first of all, this question of collaborators is nothing new. It did not begin in the 21st century. If you look at history of revolts of the enslaved, oftentimes they were betrayed by other enslaved, other Africans. The United States developed so-called Indian scouts, Philippine scouts. In fact, I'm doing research on Southeast Asia now, and it's quite remarkable that when the United States invades that archipelago in the late 19th century, delivering a knockout blow to the tottering Spanish Empire, they quickly developed the so-called Philippine Scouts, who they instructed in the dark arts of waterboarding, which they then inflicted upon Filipino guerrillas. So these exploiters, when it comes to exploitation, they can be very flexible. They have no problem with maintaining a staunch principle of white supremacy and then utilizing, even manipulating those who would ordinarily not be inducted into the halls of whiteness. I'll turn it over to you, Professor Hazard.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Horne. I'd like to just add the dimension of culture to this in some way. This theme of betrayers, those who would, quote, sell out, is old. It's an old theme, and we can trace it in religious mythology, especially in Christianity, the whole notion of Judas Iscariot, for example. From personal experience, having lived through the 1960s, I think about the kind of resistance, stereotypes that communities of color develop to call attention to these behaviors. For example, African Americans, we've had the Uncle Tom. During the 60s, I noticed that my time in Phoenix, Arizona, many of the native people who were active would refer to the equivalent in their culture as apples, red on the outside, white on the inside. Asians use the phrase banana. We've developed the notion of the Oreo. And so these notions are not new, and they penetrate the culture on various levels, right on down to popular culture. And I'd like to just thank you for letting me speak on that.
Professor Horne, pertaining to the Black radical tradition, it was shaped by so many important figures, notably, to name a few, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Malcolm X, Huey Newton, George Jackson, Assata Shakur. How would you say things, if you could give us a brief maybe overview of how things have changed, I guess, tracing all the way back to Du Bois, it could go further, but from then to now in the sensibilities and attitudes within the Black political movements in the U.S. and, especially in this age of U.S. Reaction and oppression. What are some strategies to perhaps reinvigorate some aspects of the Black radical tradition, such as Black national sovereignty, which seem to have been lost?
Well, I think what you're referring to ultimately is the point that people of African descent, at least for the last 500 years or so, have been subjected to a rather callous and brutal exploitation of their labor and or their resources, sometimes both, if you're referring to the African continent. And I think that in North America, and I took note of the fact that a disproportionate number of the individuals you mentioned have roots in North America, this contributes to a kind of class consciousness that I'm afraid to say is oftentimes misinterpreted and mistaken by those who should know better, since they consider themselves to be class warriors. What I mean is, if you're talking about slavery in particular, which blighted the landscape in North America for centuries, you're basically talking about unpaid workers. It's the unpaid segment of the working class. And that helps to generate class struggle, class consciousness, militancy, and ultimately what you refer to as the Black radical tradition. And you could say the same thing for the individuals you referenced who have roots in the Caribbean, which was also a site for callous labor exploitation, not to mention Africa itself, where you had forced labor in the Congo and forced labor and other sites on the continent. Now, that struggle culminated in the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse, which it proceeds to do in the so-called British Caribbean in the 1830s and South America in the 1850s, United States in a bloody fashion in 1865, in Brazil in 1888. And a few decades later, you have the rise of a socialist project. And as my work has tended to suggest, you have to understand what I call the triptych. That is to say, with the onset of the invasion of the Americas post 1492, you have the rise of the so-called race project, which actually is preceded by the religious project I made reference a few moments ago with regard to all the religious conflicts that are then folded into this new construction of whiteness, which inaugurates the race project, which is disrupted by the Haitian Revolution, which, by the way, also bears the insignia of a class project insofar as the unpaid workers were able to revolt and establish a state. And that helps to give a jolt of adrenaline to class consciousness and the rise of a class project. Now, with the rise of the class project, in particular the rise of organized socialist states, the capitalist countries led by the United States are a bit hysterical, and they are forced in the 1950s to inaugurate a rather shambolic retreat from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy, leading to the phenomenon that one of your questioners just made reference to, the co-optation of a number in various communities, or as they say today in the United States, communities of color. The question now becomes whether those concessions, in light of the retreat of the socialist project beginning in 1989 to 1991, whether the socialist project, in light of the continuing US conflict with the People's Republic of China, which, by the way, and I can explain this if you're interested, was a beneficiary of the conflict between Moscow and Washington, but now finds itself in the bullseye. I'm sure you've been following the story of the Chinese balloon that's been spotted over Montana, and how that led to Secretary of State Blinken canceling his trip, or the four-star general who predicted that by 2025, the United States would be in a shooting war with China. In any case, that's a brief survey of the question that you posed.
Thank you, Professor Horne. And I apologize. I meant to direct that question also to you, Dr. Hazard. If you'd like, I can repeat it.
Thank you.
It was just on the Black radical tradition and the radicals that I mentioned, how we've come to diverge from that tradition, and what, or more so, what changes. Just to ask you, what changes you've observed over even your lifetime, or your take on the evolution of the Black radical tradition over the past century or so.
Oh, thank you. Well, Professor Horne has actually done a magnificent summation of that tradition. My own personal experience is probably from the late 1950s through the 1960s, and what was happening in those communities in the Midwest. They were thriving. People were employed. And of course, we get the results known as deindustrialization some years later. So the radical tradition that I probably inherited came through Robeson, but probably comes more out of someone that's more recent and more recently tied with the labor movement and with various socialist and communist parties from the 1930s. And that would be people like Queen Mother Moore, for example, and organizations such as RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement. And they were very influential in my community in the Midwest. And they reached a peak when that community was in a transition. Those jobs were just about to leave the country. I oftentimes think about how those communities were transformed as I personally experienced neighbors moving away and ties being broken. And when I talk with experts on this, and when I read certain literature, especially popular literature, that asks the questions of, well, why did all the jobs leave the country? And the answer that we're sort of given on the ground, that's the propaganda that is spread among the people themselves, is that, well, we could pay people in foreign countries much less, and we don't have to worry about them unionizing. And, well, the question for me then becomes, well, why 1970 and 1971? Why was that not done in 1957, for example? You could still have paid people less then, and you would have collected more profit for a longer period of time. And so I personally believe that those jobs leaving the country is somehow tied to a way to break the back or help break the back of that movement that had developed in the 1960s. Not only had the music itself started to pick up revolutionary and socialist themes, and of course that was nothing new. Some of the big band jazz musicians wrote themes to so-called radical people. And the trumpeter, and I'm not recalling his name, who was shot in New York City in Slug's bar, had
Lee
done a piece. Lee Morgan, thank you, had done a piece for Angela Davis. And so those radical themes had started to permeate the popular culture and on the ground. Everybody expressed it. Everybody had afros. People took pride in their sort of personal radicalism. And so I attribute that, and of course the influence of people like Malcolm X, and of course the Nation of Islam. We were also heavily influenced by the Moorish Science Temple. I was actually introduced to the first group of people that labeled themselves Black nationalists at a Moorish Science Temple. And so all of those things helped to influence us as young people in the 1960s, those sort of second generation people who came of age in the late 1960s, in 1967 and 1968, and so who sort of inherited the legacy of the Angela Davis struggle, which many of us were exposed to people who had been involved in the labor struggle and who've been directly involved on the left. A very important person on the ground for many of us was a traveling teacher. We knew him. His name was Bob Rhodes. And so we had the kind of radicalism on the ground. And of course, we never thought about the roots of these things. They were there. We participated in them. And we also saw our legs cut off. And we began to feel the changes on the ground. Of course, many people retreated to the university. Many of us sort of fell by the wayside. So that movement, which of course I think, as I experienced it on the ground, was also very tied in with the labor movement. And in the Midwest, the people who were labeled socialists and communists also were very influential in the way we moved on the ground. So that's been my personal experience. Thank you.
Want to say thank you guys for outlining a lot of that. Over time, we have seen a decline in the ability for people to speak their truth and speak their struggles. And you guys outlined a bunch of individuals that were able to do that, some of which got killed for it, and outlined why there is a lack of it now. I'm going to turn this over to Lisiate Vuna, who has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Horne, for your time. And also, too, this is kind of a kind of moving from what we're talking about. So feel free to spin us briefly amount of time as you'd like to on this question. But reading through your book, The White Pacific, I was really interested in it. Just having ancestral ties to Oceania. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to the African Americans and West Indians who found a refuge of sorts in Hawaii during the time you were writing about, and how African Americans saw Hawaii in comparison to the U.S. From the treatment they received, from being able to find a place to live with some dignity, but then also being brought in as a source of labor. And then also, too, the parallels between the Atlantic slave trade and blackbirding in the South Seas. Thank you.
Or your roots in Hawaii?
It's close to, a little bit further south, Tonga.
Oh, I see. Well, yes, the Hawaii Kingdom, which was an independent state up until the 1890s, was quite welcoming to Black people from the North American mainland. Sailors, whalers, you may know that a major industry of the 19th century before the advent of electricity was getting whale oil to light lamps, sadly enough, harpooning these majestic species. And what's remarkable about the Hawaii Kingdom is that it was quite modern. And what happens in a very remarkable confluence of events is that the white supremacists in North America in 1853, they tried to emulate London. London, you may know, had begun to colonize what is called Hong Kong a decade earlier. The United States then still sends its Black ships into into Japan about a decade later. And in a miraculous transition that has attracted the attention of revolutionaries and scholars, Japan is able to transform itself by the 1860s, becoming something of an imperialist power all its own. In fact, Hollywood tackled that subject, you may recall, in the movie The Last Samurai. Interestingly enough, this Hollywood blockbuster does not engage in class solidarity with the Japanese capitalists who were seeking to drag Japan into capitalism. The Hollywood is identifying with the feudalists, interestingly enough, who were resisting. So what happens is that as Japan begins to modernize, the leadership in Hawaii begins to recognize that they too are in the crosshairs. And so what happens is they try to broker an alliance with Japan against encroachment by the United States. And to this very day, the plurality of the population of the archipelago, that is Hawaii, is of Japanese ancestry, because that's when that alliance basically began. This alliance by the Hawaii Kingdom was also meant to try to stymie blackbirding, which was a kind of forced labor imposed upon Melanesians and Polynesians who were dragged to Queensland, Australia, and to Fiji in order to work for next to nothing. The Hawaii Kingdom tries to interpose itself, which stokes the anger not only of US blackbirders, but also Australian and New Zealand blackbirders. And that leads to the overthrow of the Hawaii Kingdom in the 1890s, its incorporation as a US state by 1959, and presumably the 50th and final state. So certainly there was a commonality between blackbirding and the Atlantic slave trade. In fact, in my book, I suggest that there is a possibility that you had people from Melanesia and Polynesia who were blackbirded, so to speak, to the west coast of the United States, meaning that some who think that they are wholly and exclusively African American may also be of Melanesian and or Polynesian ancestry as well.
That's amazing. Thank you, Dr. Horne.
So, Dr. Horn, I have been reading your book on Paul Robeson, and so I want to say, for one, thank you. Um, I'm a little late on it. I mean, I'm 25 years old, but I would love for you to outline the historical importance of Paul Robeson, an individual who was not afraid to tell the system of which that he knew exploited him, um, that he was not inferior, and an individual who, even then, so I believe you've mentioned on numerous occasions that, if it wasn't for his wife, then he probably wouldn't have been, the major star that he is today. So I'd love for you to talk on the historical importance of Robeson. I mean, this is Black History Month, and I feel like individuals who say they know Black history really don't. And if you tell them who Paul Robeson is, they think you're talking about the dude that's walking down the street.
So he was born in Central Jersey in 1898. We're approaching the 125th anniversary of his birth, expiring not far from there in Philadelphia, circa 1976. In between, he was a star athlete at Rutgers University in football, track and field, baseball, basketball, matriculated in law school, graduated from Columbia University, playing professional football. As you suggest, his spouse, Islanda, pushes him onto the stage where he becomes a renowned singer and actor. His performance of Shakespeare's Othello is considered to be the gold standard to this very day. He expatriates to London for most of the 1920s and 1930s and becomes a star of cinema as well. But he is attracted to the left, not least by his friend and comrade, who also wrote a book about William Patterson. This is a time of the rise of fascism. This is also the time of the establishment of a socialist country in Moscow. He's attracted to the latter in order to destabilize the former. Those two forces meet on the battlefield in Spain during the Spanish Civil War of the late 1930s, and Robeson performs for the progressive forces in Spain. But alas, as you may know, the virus of war is spreading in Europe, and Robeson decides that he does not want to be trapped behind the lines of war and decides to come back home. When he comes back home in the early 1940s, the United States is in the process of joining the anti-fascist alliance itself to combat Hitler's Germany, Italian fascism, and ultimately Japanese militarism. And Robeson is part of that struggle. Actually, as I say in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, helping to convince many Black Americans that they should not be pro-Tokyo, of which there were many, as I state in that book. In any case, he and the United States seemed to be on the same page until the end of World War II, when the United States launches the Red Scare against domestic radicalism, against domestic communists, socialists, and radicals, a process from which this movement has hardly recovered to this very day. Robeson's a major victim of this dastardly process. His income falls from the six figures to the low four figures. The US authorities seize his passport, preventing him from leaving the country. Yet he engages once again in solidarity with the Black American struggle, aligning with the aforementioned William Patterson in filing a petition at the United Nations that charges the United States with genocide against Black people, putting US Jim Crow and apartheid in the spotlight, which causes, as I noted a moment or two ago, an agonizing and shambolic retreat of this horrific system. But Robeson pays the ultimate price, as does Patterson, who is jailed during the 1950s. Finally, international pressure, not least from India, because Robeson was quite conversant with Indian leaders such as Prime Minister Nehru, and they put pressure on the United States. His passport is returned. He immediately leaves, probably overdoes it. His health begins to deteriorate. His spouse dies. He retreats ultimately in the 1960s, to a self-imposed exile in Philadelphia. But it's fair to say that Robeson, in many ways, was the tallest tree in our forest. He was familiar with many different languages. He oftentimes suggested that if he had not been pushed into singing and acting, he might have become a professor of languages at a small college, professor of philology, for example, and was a frequent donor when his salary was higher before the Red Scare to progressive and radical movements, a staunch union man, supporter of unionizing the workforce. And it's difficult to overestimate what our movement lost when Robeson was pilloried and pulverized by the U.S. authorities.
Thank you, thank you. And you've referenced on many occasions, Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois is sacrificial lambs, in your words. And I think that is very, very truthful. And so I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Hazard, who has a couple questions to ask you.
Oh, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about hip hop on and off for the past 20 years. I've written a little about the dance and hip hop culture. And it dawned on me while I was talking with some young people that there are many who have never heard a song in which a woman was not referred to as a bitch. And so I've been thinking a lot about the role of culture and what that means for young people as they grow up. And so my question is, I would like for you to just say something about the role of expressive culture, especially the role of culture in either fostering or promoting revolutionary social change or inhibiting revolutionary social change.
Well, the aforementioned Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, assassinated approximately 50 years ago during the height of the liberation struggle in his homeland by the Portuguese fascists, wrote on this subject, and I would just reference that for anyone who would like to dig a little deeper. I would say that expressive culture, particularly music, theater, cinema, is extremely important in terms of capturing the sentiments of progressive humankind and representing it to the working class, to the oppressed, in words, in music, etc., that strikes the heart, that not only strikes the brain, but strikes the heart. I'm sure that the Cubans have this saying that people come to revolutionary movements through their stomach, that is to say, they're poor and hungry, through their heart, because they're upset with the world in which they find themselves and are upset with homelessness, and it leads them to a deeper consciousness, or through their brains. That is to say, ultimately, through those latter two processes, they come to this level of consciousness that drives them into revolutionary struggle. So if you look at the history of our movements, it's no accident that it has attracted luminaries amongst the cultural warriors. I'm thinking, for example, of the early work of Richard Wright, the great Black American novelist. I'm thinking of the art. Pablo Picasso, who of course was in solidarity with the peace movement during a very difficult time, and the dove of peace in many ways is captured by Picasso in some of his most invigorating works. I'm thinking of the Irish playwright Sean O'Casey, whose works continue to be studied to this very day. I could go on in that vein, but I think the point by now should be clear that obviously with the Red Scare, the attack on the left, the attack on revolutionary forces, that had its intended consequence, which was to deprive upcoming generations of positive and revolutionary examples. And when you talk about the phenomenon that you just mentioned, where many of our youth, sad to say, have never heard a song that doesn't refer to women in a derogatory fashion. Well, obviously, that's a direct result of political economy, because if you wanted to provide a revolutionary example, you might not end up on the Grammys on Sunday night from Los Angeles, sponsored by the recording companies, which are part of larger forces of monopoly capitalism. So once again, what we have seen unfold is hardly accidental. It's a direct outgrowth of rather malignant forces who, at the moment at least, have all too much power.
Thank you.
Dr. Horne, I wanted to go back to Robeson, if we possibly can, in a small aspect. He talked about how the treatment of Black individuals in Europe was vastly different from the way that he was treated during Jim Crow eras. And so my question to you is, why a place like, for a lot of people, London? I have a distant relative of mine, ancestor, I should say, because they're no longer with us, by the name of Marian Anderson, who, like Robeson, traveled all throughout Europe, played in Germany, played in Moscow, and even Robeson, stating that he felt like he was a human being in Russia. Why during many different times? We can even go into James Baldwin, feeling like he had a better life in London. I would love for you to, if you can, explain that. Not in any way, because it's not that it's confusing to me, but when people hear that, a lot of people come to this conclusion. Well, when you talk about like how you stated, the religious conflict is due to whiteness, and whiteness being a construct of race and oppression. I know that there are people out there that kind of are like weirded out by hearing that these people would feel safer in a place where these things originated. So if you could.
Well, I think it's ultimately comprehensible. That is to say that London, amongst other peculiar aspects of its culture, has a kind of accent discrimination. People in London say they can tell what neighborhood someone is from based upon their accents. I've been made to understand that everyone on this particular call would be characterized as having a U.S. accent, as did Robeson. Now, if you were Jamaican or Nigerian in London, you might not necessarily expect to be treated like Robeson was treated. That's point number one. Point number two, I think what you're speaking to also addresses how horrible the United States has been, particularly to its population of African descent. What's interesting nowadays is that there is a debate that I'm happy to say I helped to ignite, suggesting that when the settlers in North America revolted against London's rule, they were driven in no small measure by the desire to not only break free from London so they could continue moving west and seizing the land of the Native Americans, but also so that that land could be stocked, so to speak, by enslaved Africans. And so it's no accident that in the 21st century, a country that was founded upon land theft and slavery continues to treat the products of that horrific process as if this were still 1776, for example. I refer you only to Memphis, once again, where you saw a transition from the Second Amendment to the US Constitution, which is the juridical basis for mass shootings that have rocked California in recent weeks. It basically meant that militias of settlers could be established to be armed to repress indigenous revolts and enslaved African revolts. After the US Civil War, you have the rise of lynch mobs of settlers who turn executing Black men in particular into carnivals, with, in this pre-radio, pre-television age, thousands flocking, photographs taken, many of which are now in museums, oftentimes the systematic dismemberment of the victim that leads to an anti-lynching movement. And that movement then forces lynching to retreat. And now you see that there's a movement of having lynch mobs in blue uniforms. That is to say, the police, as in Memphis, once again. The next point I would make is that it would be a mistake to assume that all of those who are defined as white in this country, which, by the way, is a very expansive definition. It can include those who are Palestinians, for example. It can include those who are Iranian, for example. I've even seen Egyptians, at least certain Egyptians, defined as white as well. It would be a mistake to assume that in their homelands, Black people would be treated in as atrocious a fashion as they might be treated in the United States of America. That is to say, you have to make a distinction between a Persian American, for example, and a Persian. If you don't, you're assuming that US culture has polluted the entire world. To a certain extent it has, but not on every level. And if you look at the most populous country in Europe, I'm speaking of Russia, whose population of 150 million is almost twice that of number 2, Germany, of 82 million. As the Western European nations were getting fat from the plunder of the African slave trade and land theft, the Iberians, the British, the French, etc., the Russians were moving west and south. And of course, we're oftentimes coming into conflict with people who we would call Asian. Now, that sets up a contradiction, a central contradiction in European history, which is playing out as we speak. I've written about this, by the way. I think you can find it on the Black Agenda Report website, whereby you see that the Western European nations were world powers, but not necessarily a major power in their own backyard, speaking of Europe. And that leads repeatedly the Europeans to try to break that contradiction. You saw Sweden, which had been a major military power, believe it or not, even though its contemporary population is only about 9 million. But that's not surprising. The contemporary population of Portugal is only 10 million, and it was ruling Brazil, one of the most populous nations on planet Earth. Sweden was a major military power until it tried to invade Russia in the early 1700s. Napoleon met his defeat when he invaded Russia in the 1800s. The Western European nations ganged up on Russia in the Crimea War of the 1850s and recruited the sick man of Europe, Turkey, to do so. Russia was then defeated by Japan, and a turning point for the struggle against white supremacy circa 1905, Du Bois, Nehru, Ho Chi Minh, Sun Yat-sen of China all spoke about the importance of that defeat. Russia, in turn, sought to strike back by supporting the Abyssinians, the Ethiopians, when they were invaded by the Italians in the 1890s, for example. That process continues post-1917 with Russia helping to assist African liberation, which is one of the reasons why Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was welcomed in Pretoria just this past week. There will be military maneuvers between South Africa and Russia, and perhaps including China in the next few days. The former Soviet republic that is Belarus, which is, shall we say, seen as in the same category today in the North Atlantic camp as Russia. The leader was just feted in Zimbabwe this past week as well. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that in order to understand the phenomenon that undergirds your question, you have to, A, understand how horrible the United States has been. And you should not expect every country to emulate the horrible nature of the United States of America. And B, you need to understand that the maltreatment and mistreatment of those not inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness grows organically from US culture and history. And fortunately, every country does not have the horrible history and culture that has been exhibited in the United States of America.
Unfortunately, Dr. Gerald Horne was not able to stay as long as his podcast had hoped. I want to thank everybody for watching, everybody who contributed to this episode, everybody who wrote down questions. It was a very, very good experience for me, and I feel like for the viewers. And so I want to, give a round of applause for everybody who was involved. Dr. Horne, Dr. Katrina Hazard, Lisiate Vuna, Derek, aka Plants Fanon, Rick from Decolonized Buffalo Podcast, and I also want to shout out the pen and the paper who couldn't be with us for this episode, which I was hoping, but maybe in the future. But again, I want to thank everybody who's contributed to this episode. It was dope to be a part of this. So again, I'll see everybody in the next episode.